morning, everybody. It's such a great pleasure being here in front of you in a 3D mode instead of in a 2D. It's quite a pleasant change, I have to say. I will try to help the conference to catch up in time, so we will start right away. This part of the conference will actually focus on fuels, but we will give it a bit of a different twist. We will look at the impact that the emerging, that's one of my favorite phrases, the emerging landscape of decarbonization requirements. It's already there, it's not emerging anymore. The impact that will have on the choices that we have to make. And since we're talking about analytics and investments, we will also try to give it a bit of a monetary flavor at the end. So please bear with me. What you see on the screen right now is a slide that we tend to use when we are trying to explain what the challenge for shipping is, what the decarbonization challenge is. And the graph on the right-hand side was the outcome, the result of our 2020 energy transition outlook, where we tried to model what the forecasted fuel mix will be in 2050. And as you see, it's following a base case scenario. It was quite opposite of optimistic. It was quite conservative. Based on that, we would still have 40% in the fuel mix of fuels coming from fossil origin. However, during the last 2 years, and I have to explain that was based on a base case scenario that was informed by the already announced policies at that point in time. But over the last 2 years, we have seen policies that have been announced on a global scale. We have seen also the IMO setting a more solid agenda with measures that we will be discussing in the next slide. And we end up with a kind of a different view of the future. You see on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. That is also fed by information about the introduction of the life cycle approach. If we have that in place, then shipping will probably marginally meet both targets for 2050, but both targets as they still are. And there is a question mark there because there are discussions about revisions. If we go for net zero, then that might not be enough. We will have to use the life cycle approach, and we will talk about that in the next session. So what is the emerging landscape? What do ships have to face right now? In a simplistic way to view things, we have a timeline until, let's say, the next decade. By January 2023, so in a few months from now, ships are going to face what we call the EEXI, the technical filter, and at the same time we'll have to go down the decarbonization trajectory that is imposed by IMO, the Carbon Intensity Indicator, CII. That's not the only trajectory that ships are going to have to face. We also see movement from the European Union in the context of the Fit for 55. I hope this was not an alarm or a fire drill. In the Fit for 55 context, set of regulations, you have also decarbonization trajectories that are presented in the form of Fuel EU. And you also have the market that is pushing ships and fleets to decarbonize, again, introducing their own decarbonization trajectories. We mentioned here in this slide the Poseidon Principles and the Sea Cargo Charter. This actually requires now different lines of reporting, or maybe an approach that has to look for a combined trajectory, and that trajectory will be served by the proper choice of fuel. And what is also now developing is a trend to assess zero carbon freight, to ask for zero carbon freight services. We've seen that with the cargo owners zero emission vessels movement a little before COP26 took place, and also being introduced under the context of the Green Corridors with the Clydebank Declaration. Why do I mention that? Because we have now a definition information of what we actually call zero carbon, and it has it infers the use of a life cycle approach, looking at how the fuel is produced, delivered, and then consumed. So we are now looking at the well-to-wake approach, and it is also now finding its way into the IMO. What has been also made clear during the last couple of years in all the studies that have seen the light of day is that the energy transition will be based on two actual value chains, the hydrogen value chain and the carbon value chain. The topic of this presentation is mainly focused on the hydrogen value chain, and this is looking at how the energy conversion from production to consumption takes place by having that energy token, that energy building block hydrogen as a unit in order to produce carbon neutral fuels at the end for consumption at the consumer end. It is based on the concept of the production of fuels and what it takes place during that production and what is the carbon footprint of the production of fuels, the distribution, and of course the consumption. Where do we stand as far as regulations therefore are concerned? Well, there is a movement in the next MEPC. The life cycle approach will be discussed. We already have had a number of proposals, mainly coming from the European Union, Japan and others, that in Australia, that requested the discussion to kick off and have an introduction of a framework in order to address this life cycle approach, this calculation of the carbon footprint of fuels, so that we can actually compare apples to apples and have carbon factors in our calculations when we calculate the carbon intensity of our operations. That being said, as far as the EU is concerned, EU has already introduced in the context of the Fit for 55 agenda within the Fuel EU regulation an approach towards calculating and evaluating the carbon footprint of the different fuels from a life cycle perspective. And it has even presented a table of the different fuels with the different carbon factors looking at the production until the consumption on board ships. And if we take that into consideration, then you will see that you have different actual results when you include production into the total calculation of the carbon footprint of fuels. There are carbon neutral fuels in the sense that when you are producing them, you are capturing somehow the carbon that is produced from production, and therefore whatever is emitted at the end on the ship has already been captured or stored, and therefore the balance is net. That is called net zero. But you also have green fuels, zero carbon fuels, that do not have a carbon atom in their molecule, and therefore their emissions are considered as zero carbon. However, what you see on this slide is that even on the ones that we are considering green fuels, when you are actually doing what we call the carbon accounting of the combustion and the final calculation of the carbon footprint, there are elements that can actually contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, either CO2, the carbon dioxide itself, or other emissions that can be categorized as greenhouse gases. That's why you see, for example, ammonia there. The green ammonia is not completely zero because it does have some CO2 produced either from a secondary fuel that will be required for ammonia combustion or from other emissions that are generated through the combustion of ammonia. And then that begs the question, do we have enough of the production capacity so that shipping can get the required quantities of green fuels, the required quantities for its decarbonization purposes? Well, at this point, the straightforward answer is no, right off the bat. It's easy to answer that. And what is actually required is a substantial scaling up of the renewables infrastructure. What you see on this slide is an exercise that we did with the Mercer McKinney Miller Center, being founding partners. We started that straight away from the inauguration of the center. It was one of the first exercises we did. And what we found out is that if we need to produce the required quantities that shipping wants for, say, green ammonia or green methanol, then the production, the installation of photovoltaics, for example, will have to scale up by 4, wind by a factor of 5, and if you add the other consumers into that equation, then the renewable energy would actually have to scale up in a factor of 7 to 10. This is a significant scaling up that has to take place. What we already see, however, is that the trend is actually there, and we see this picking up. There is also geopolitics that helps that scaling up as well. So if you want to look at the nitty-gritty part of the fuels themselves, you have a number of fuels that are being now discussed. Some of them have a more a higher rate of maturity as far as their technology is concerned, as far as the processes are concerned, and the experience that the industry itself has. For example, if you look at the methane or methanol, there are already technologies that can support that. When we say methane, we mean LNG. There are technologies, there are engine sets, there are fuel gas supply equipments and tanks. We have technologies that are currently proven and can actually support the usage of those fuels. When you venture into what we call the zero carbon fuel territory with ammonia and hydrogen, then things start to change a bit. As far as ammonia is concerned, the expected rolling out of the first engines is in 2 years from now. With hydrogen is a long-term solution. It is considered the token, the building block of the other fuels when we're talking about carbon neutrality and carbon neutral fuels. However, the use of hydrogen itself as a fuel for deep sea operations is somewhat challenging currently, and we see that this is probably going to be in the mix of deep sea shipping in the mid to long term. However, there are technologies that can support the use of hydrogen as well, particularly in the power generation of onboard vessels. If you look at the example of fuel cells, for example, in some particular segments, then hydrogen is already considered as a solution. However, you would also notice that there are differences between the fuels as far as risks are concerned, and whether we have solved or not the risks that are related to conventional fuels. Once somebody or one is actually looking at the risk profile of the new renewable fuels that are suggested for the decarbonization purposes of our industry, then that actually is a completely different scale of a problem. Ammonia has a toxicity problem, and therefore the risk is considerable, and it has to be assessed when we're talking about an ammonia fuel vessel. And hydrogen is very explosive, and industry needs to have more experience on that in order to support it. If you also look at the specifics, so the economics, how do you bring those fuels on board? Methanol would actually require, as you see on this slide, almost 2.5 the volume of what we have for conventional fuels in order to accommodate the same trip. Ammonia a bit larger than that. However, with methanol you have the benefit of having a less complicated fuel gas supply system and storage requirements that you have with a cryogenic type fuel, and a fuel that is high in toxicity. And we're venturing now into the impact. So what you see on the left-hand side is an overview of some analysis. We looked into the data of how three major segments will actually perform against the requirements of CII until the end of the decade. And what you see is that all three major categories at the end of this decade will actually face some significant challenges with regards to the CII rating. You see that almost half of the fleet, even more, in all three categories will actually be rated D or E, which in the latter case will have to, it will actually ask the vessel to explore improvement options. But what happens if you make a different choice in fuel? And if you start incorporating a carbon factor different than what we have from a conventional fuel, you see, particularly here in the three cases that we have, with the VLCC, a 14,000 TEU container, and a Capsarmax, that in the case of LNG, it gets a longer CII life, considerably longer. Also with methanol, but keep in mind that methanol contributes a bit less to the decarbonization if we don't calculate the whole life cycle, and it's not green or biomethanol. It has a lesser impact on the reduction of emissions when you expect that LNG will actually contribute about 20%, methanol will contribute about 10%. And I did promise that we'll also try to give you a sense of monetization when we're looking at the impact. The regulatory scheme that we have is currently in development, of course, that puts a direct price on emissions is the one that we have in the European Union. Either the EU ETS or the Fuel EU, they look at the emissions that are generated, and based on the nature of the emissions, based on the life cycle approach, the carbon, the energy intensity of the vessel, then it actually either requests the vessel to submit allowances or, in the Fuel EU case, administers a penalty. What I want to highlight here, as I venture into the end of my presentation, is the fact that in all three cases, the cost of having a conventional fuel gets significant. In the container case, you see that the amount that this container will actually have to pay in allowances by 2025 range up to 400,000 euros. That's in 2025. So that's an added operational cost that needs to be incorporated in the planning and the decarbonization strategy of a company when we're looking at how our ships will perform against the trajectories that I mentioned at the beginning. Therefore, in order to conclude, and I think I made it with some time to spare, we discussed about the different decarbonization trajectories. I made reference to the emerging, and I corrected myself, it's no longer emerging, it is here, the decarbonization landscape of requirements that has a multitude of decarbonization trajectories and KPIs that have to be met. And therefore, what we actually have to do is find that combined trajectory that we have to align our vessels and fleets against, benchmark our vessels against and fleets against this requirement, and explore improvement options. In many cases, that improvement option, particularly for the new building and replacement vessels that we have to include in our fleet in the mid and long-term future, will come in the form of a fuel. What we also highlighted is the fact that carbon is getting a price. Carbon at some point will have a price. And where there is a price, there is an opportunity, and a proper strategy will actually serve a company explore and find that opportunity. Thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm ready with 35 seconds to start.